All right, so the United States enters World War One in April of 1917. And when the United States enters the war in April of 1917, at least that's when they declare war, they don't really start fighting until the fall of 1917. However, in that period between the fall and then the following year, the war comes to a very quick end. And it's really just because everybody else is fatigued, and the United States comes in and they are very well prepared to start fighting. The war ultimately comes to an end in November of 1918, November 11th. Once that happens, very quickly, Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States, and all the other big leaders of France, Britain, and Italy go straight to Paris, to the Palace of Versailles, and they wind up working on a treaty. And the treaty, called the Treaty of Versailles, is signed in June of 1919. Now, the goals of everybody who comes to that meeting has different, right? So the United States, Woodrow Wilson famously is looking for sort of peace. He doesn't want there to be a big winner, right? He calls it peace in our time. Britain, who had been a big competitor with Germany, wanted to have control over Germany's colonies and Britain wanted to secure its own success. France really wanted to punish Germany. So much of the fighting had happened in France that France, really wanted to punish Germany. Italy really just wanted some possessions, wanted to get some gold, some goods out of it. When the treaty is ultimately signed, Germany is severely punished. So here is a copy or a couple of clauses from the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. So you're going to see here, right, Britain gets some things that it wants. Britain gets that Germany is going to surrender all of its colonies. Germany has to reduce its military, which you have to remember, right? For Germany, the military was a huge thing, right? The Germans had worked so long to develop this military and this navy. They also have to reduce their navy. But the thing that really sort of sticks to the Germans is that they must accept responsibility. So clause 231 of the treaty is called the War Guilt Clause. And this is where Germany must accept all of the guilt for the war. And then once they've accepted guilt, clause 232 is what we call the reparations clause. The British and the French force Germany to sign, to send money over to the Allies for as long as they had to pay off, and you're talking billions of dollars, billions of marks. This is going to become a huge problem for Germany, and we're going to look at that in a little bit. So this has a huge impact on the Germans themselves, right? They start to feel that they are being taken advantage of, and this helps cause the rise of German nationalism and Nazism. The same is true for Italy, right? Italy is left out of this war, of this treaty, right? Italy basically gets nothing from this. They were a junior partner. They really didn't do too much other than fight Austria in northern Italy, but otherwise, basically, they did very, 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 very little. So, let's pull this up here. So what ultimately happens is, obviously, we know that there is a massive depression that occurs in the end of the 1920s and into the 1930s. Part of that is due largely because of wartime spending. When the United States and others get involved in the war, they ramp up spending. You're producing material within the factories. You're increasing agricultural production so that you can feed your soldiers. All of this is happening, and the United States and Britain and France are spending a ton of money. Well, when the war comes to an end and you don't need that money any longer, it creates a massive decline. And all of that ultimately happens in the United States as well as Europe. And this is just an image of that, right? So if you look at the United States, right, the United States as the country that had as the country that I guess, was the least impacted by the war because none of the fighting happened in the United States, ramps up its production really quickly by by the by the 1920s, right? And you can see that in 1929, unemployment is at an all-time low in the United States. However, but if you notice, when the stock market crash happens and then other events happen, the United States is the one that really takes the greatest hit, reaching about a third of the population being unemployed by 1932. So you're talking, while other countries are impacted less. So let's talk about the rise of sort of radical political ideology. Okay, so there is a huge growth in disaffection within Europe as a result of the Great Depression and as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. In Italy, the first place to really become a fascist country in the 1920s, the reason they become fascist is because Italy is really left out of the treaty. And they they feel disaffected by the fact that they had helped the British and the French win and the Americans win against the German imperialism and German aggression of Wilhelm and they also are disaffected by the fact that the treaty had created massive inflation within Italy. Southern Italy is a very agricultural part of the country, and because of that, when the war was going on, the southern Italian economy was booming because you have to feed all of the different people of within the war effort. So when World War I comes to an end, they are the first group of people to really start losing money. And as a result of that, you have massive increases in unemployment and poverty across Italy. For Japan, it was, as I say here, dependent on foreign aid. And as money is starting to slow down, they are becoming less solvent. They have less money. The United States in the 1920s also turns into what's called economic nationalism, where they basically don't really send money away. They sort of keep money within the country. But the other part of this is that Japan really felt it was being taken advantage of. Japan by the 1920s, again, we remember, I hope, that Japan really was starting to become very imperialist in the 19 teens and 20s and before that. Well, by the time that the United States, Britain, and France are fighting in World War I, Japan is being beaten back, right? So the United States tries to push Japanese expansion out, same with the British and the French. So Japan becomes disaffected by the idea that everybody else is allowed to have colonies, but we are not. Finally, for the Germans, they use the Treaty of Versailles as sort of a rallying point, right? They see themselves as being taken advantage of by Europe. They are put into massive amounts of debt. They are stripped of their colonies. Their army and navy have been stripped to bare bones. So the Germans are really disaffected by this, and they really start focusing on this nationalism. One of the things that Hitler does when he comes to power officially as chancellor in 1933 is he starts arguing for something called Lebensraum. It's the word I have at the end of the German point, right? The Lebensraum. Lebensraum means living space. This is a territory that Germany wanted to sort of take over its surrounding areas, including the Rhineland, which is part of France that was taken away after was part of Germany, part of France, sort of back and forth, but given back to France after World War I. That's one of the parts. Czechoslovakia. What Hitler wants to do is he wants to connect all people of German speaking nationality. So he wants to connect people in the Rhineland who speak German and are Germans. Same with the people in Austria. Same with the people in Czechoslovakia. All of this leads to, as I say here on the bottom, massive aggression. So the Italians try and invade Ethiopia and parts of Albania. Japan invades Manchuria and other parts of Asia. Germany occupies those places I just mentioned. All of these things are trying to get more and more territory. We call this period in the 1930s the period of appeasement because no one is really doing anything to stop Hitler, to stop Japan, to stop Italy, basically letting this all go on. And the reason is everybody feels that they are just so concerned about starting another war. We have just had massive amounts of death, and we can't afford to have any more people being killed. Ultimately, we know that war does begin, right? The war officially begins in Europe in September of 1939. Although war had been going on between China and Japan and Asia, it officially begins in Europe in 1939. There are two sides to the war, right? There's the Axis powers that are essentially Germany, Italy, and Japan, while for the Allies, at first, it's Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, but then ultimately, obviously, the United States joins on. So this is just a map of what Germany looks like by September of 1939. You'll see that Germany is huge, right? The red area is what I guess you would consider a sort of official Germany. This is Germany that, this is the German Empire, or I guess Germany. Yeah, it's a German Empire in 1933 when Hitler takes over. The orange areas in the west around the Rhine River, and then in Austria are the places that Germany takes over in 1935, 34, 5, and then you have the yellow regions. You have all these different areas that Germany takes over, growing again that Lebensraum. For Japan, same thing. Japan is taking over a lot more places, right? Japan, obviously, the island off the coast of Asia, but then you have Japan taking over Manchuria and down towards the eastern coast of China. They take over Southeast Asia, French Indochina, Thailand, Burma, and all those places. You have Japan expanding their territory. But the point I want you to notice here is that Japanese territory is expanding much more into the Pacific, getting very close to the Hawaiian Islands, Midway Islands, the United States' territory. And that's one of the reasons that you have the bombing of Pearl Harbor, because the United States is getting very fearful of how close, the United States is getting fearful of how close Japan is getting, so the United States starts using their Navy to force them back. And obviously Japan then takes it upon themselves to attack at Pearl Harbor. So as we are moving forward, right, when we talk next, we're going to be looking at World War II and sort of how those land grabs lead to increased economic competition, and then obviously into the World War that will happen from 1939 until 1945, and we'll look at sort of what's the impact afterward. I do want to pull up here this other document, right? So this is a document given, this is a speech given by Hitler in 1921, and this speech is a speech where he lays out Nazism, right? And he gives out the idea of what does it mean, so how do we use nationalism to sort of bring people together, and then what do we mean by National Socialism? So if you look up here, right, this is going to talk a lot about sort of drumming up the feelings of nationalism. He talks about Frederick the Great, who Frederick the Great was the king of Germany in the mid 18th century, and he's sort of drumming up that German nationalism. I should say he's the king of Prussia. And then you have down here talking about sort of how we've been taken advantage of by the Treaty of Versailles. And he's, again, drumming up that support. And then finally, he talks about the idea of what is National Socialism. So good luck, gentlemen. Have a great day.